Hello, everyone. This is Al-Fadi. Welcome back to a continuation of our discussions concerning Mecca and the search for a place. Last time we talked about whether or not Mecca was a prominent city or commerce city in along the way of the trade routes, and I think we debunked that easily by showing just other alternatives that were raised by certain scholars. One of those was Patricia Crone. Today, Dr. J, who's with me here in studio, is going to show even that Patricia Crone made the case that Mecca could not have been along the trade route on land, that there is a possibility that the Red Sea was used as an alternative to basically distribute loads and merchandise. Today, Dr. J is going to even challenge that narrative as well. And for that, let's turn our attention to him and see what kind of new information he has for us today. Hey, brother, how are you?
Well, listen, this is not going to be an easy episode for you to listen to.
I can handle a lot of stuff.
I hope you can, because we're going to actually confront your town. You're going to confront Jeddah, where you love and grow up, and
Amen.
where you have always, all your childhood memories are going to come crashing down, unfortunately. But we've got to do that.
We have the best counselors ever.
Well, this is the difficulty with history. History will sometimes smash all your preconceived ideas of things that you love. And Jeddah you love. And what do you know? Well, let me just ask you, what have you been told growing up in Jeddah? When was Jeddah created, from everything you have been told?
Well, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, we never really studied exactly the history of Jeddah, but the idea it's existed for as long as Mecca existed, basically.
Okay, and so if Mecca existed from the time of Adam and Eve, Jeddah would have existed from the time of Adam and Eve?
Long time. I mean,
that's
at least in the
pretty much
early, 3-4 centuries, we would say like 4th century, 5th century, 6th century. Never doubted that it did exist around that time.
Okay, and would have it existed at the time Abraham was living?
Possibly.
19th, 20th century
Possibly.
BC?
Possibly.
And of course you have to. The assumption is yes, that is so.
Yeah.
So if that is the case, because what is Jeddah for? What is its purpose?
Well, it's a port city. I mean, that's the most important thing about
For
Jeddah.
what?
To bring stuff inland. And obviously the
To where?
closest major city to Jeddah would be Mecca.
Okay,
That's the
it
closest
really
one.
is only a port city for Mecca, right?
Well, I mean, we have a door, or I should say a gate, that is known as the Gate of Mecca in Jeddah, meaning that when stuff comes into Jeddah, they will go through that gate all the way to Mecca, whether
Okay,
caravan,
Let's
pilgrims.
put a map up here so people can see what we're talking about.
And also, by the way, Jeddah is the place where the pilgrims would have came in to go to Mecca as well via sea.
Yeah, and so let's go and let's look at what the standard Islamic narrative said. Those are 4 cities. Can you see them up there? Jeddah, Mecca, that's what we're talking about, Jeddah and Mecca up here. And then up above that, you see Yanbu and Yathrib. Yanbu would be the port city for Yathrib, which is also a very ancient town. There's lots of history for Yathrib. No one suggests that Yathrib did not exist in the 7th century. Yanbu also exists in the 7th century. There's lots of records about Yanbu. So Yanbu is a port city for Yathrib. Jeddah is a port city for Mecca. And what we're going to do is we're not going to confront those two up there because there's lots of documentation. What we're going to confront is Jeddah and Mecca, because even Patricia Crone, all of the Patricia Crone would say, well, even before Patricia Crone debunked the land route theory, remember we talked about the land route theory in the last episode, and that's the land route theory that Montgomery Watt said, that it went from Aden, came across the sea, went from Aden up to Mecca, then to Yathrib, and then on up to Gaza and the Mediterranean. That's the land route theory that Patricia Crone pretty much shut down in 1987 with her book, Meccan Trade and the Lies of Islam. Now, what her theory was if it's not going by land, it has to go by sea, which means it has to go this direction here. And so she always assumed it came this way, coming down across the Arabian Sea, down up through the eastern coast of the Red Sea, up through Jeddah, then to Yanbu, then on up to the Gulf of Aqaba, and then up to Petra. Nobody had any problem with that. I didn't have a problem with that. And when I read her book in 1987, I said, whew, finally, she's able to now redirect it. She shut down the land route theory, but she still had the sea route theory as a possibility.
Right.
Well, here's the problem. She didn't go far enough.
In terms of her research, you mean?
Her research, if you're going to do the research, and I remember doing the land route theory, and I've been talking about the land route theory and how that got debunked by Patricia Corona. You've heard me do it. We've done it. We've had episodes on it, and I remember putting that up there. And I remember even talking and asking people, who were on the show, what do you think about that theory? And they all agreed, yeah, it had to go by the sea, it had to go up by the Red Sea, and therefore it went to Mecca that way. Which still suggests that Mecca existed then in the 7th century, right?
Right. I mean, I don't think she was denying, at least some significance to Mecca, but she's showing that it was a later development when it comes to Mecca, for instance.
Okay, well, there are others that came through, and this is another thing that comes up, and I want you to look at this map here. Take a look at what these arrows that are going right now. This is Alexander the Great. So the theory is that even Alexander the Great went this way. Way back in the 4th century BC, 328, he also went to Mecca via Jeddah. That's what the standard Islamic narrative talks about. That's what all of my professors have assumed. Everybody assumes, even as far back as the 4th century BC, Alexander the Great went that way. And
so Alexander the Great is known as Dhul Qarnayn. I can assure you of this. I never grew up in Jeddah knowing that Dhul Qarnayn was in my city.
All right, well, he was in your city according to everything we knew from before this year, 2021. 2021, we're starting to look at this anew. We do know also that he had 3 different expeditions that left from, they always would leave from up here. Why? Because this is what is today Basra, but that is where all the expeditions went. Now, what he did, he had one expedition that went up to Bahrain, so it just went down, let's just get the arrows up, went just as far as that little island. That was the first expedition. That's in his biography. That we have no problem with. We know there was a second expedition that went this way from down across the Persian Gulf over to Oman and went as far as Oman and then came back again. But he wanted to see whether or not he could go and attack Egypt. And he wanted to use the sea to attack Egypt. So he had another expedition follow this route here. Let's look at this route here. And this comes from Basra, down through the Gulf of Oman, around Arabia, down to the Arabian Sea, and then shoots up the Red Sea, supposedly stopping at Jeddah and supposedly stopping at Yanbu. But the reason why he won that expedition is he wanted to see if he could take a force all the way up to Egypt and attack it and conquer it, rather than having to go through the Mediterranean, which is all very well fortified. This area was not fortified. Well, that's pretty clever. The problem is, if you look at the rest of the account, his generals then turned around and came right back home. And the reason why is because there was no provisions. They couldn't find any provisions to accommodate huge armies on the eastern coast of the Red Sea.
And you need that, of course, because you cannot just be in the sea for the long time, without having locations, places to have soldiers in there, rest areas, refuel if you wish.
Absolutely. And this is the whole reason why he even sent that expedition, to see if that was a possibility. It was not a possibility. But wait a minute. No place for supplies on the Arabian coast? Why not? Well, I was asking this question. Earlier this year. And so I decided, I put this question out there in one of my videos. And this is the great thing about YouTube. One thing I love about YouTube, which Patricia Crone did not have at her disposal. When she was doing her research back in the 1970s and 1980s, she only had Michael Cook and her and maybe 2 or 3 others who were there at School in Oriental and African Studies who would talk about this. See, with YouTube, we don't just have 3 or 4 people we can knock heads together. We have hundreds. And that's what I love about the comments, because in the comments, people started saying, Jay, have you taken a look? Have you gone a historical study of the Red Sea? Have you looked back? And I remember I talked about Jeddah being from the 2nd century BC, and I knew it was from the 2nd century BC because I went to Wikipedia, and Wikipedia says that it was the earliest records we have of Jeddah is 2nd century BC. So I put that up there. Man, did I get hammered. This is back in February, March of this year.
Hammered by people that know that there is other data that contradicts what you're saying, and they wanted to alert you to it.
Well, no, they were kind of laughing at me because I was using Wikipedia. They said, you don't use Wikipedia as your source. You can do better than that, Jay. And I said, I hadn't thought about that. I always thought that you use Wikipedia for historical material, and if there was a dispute, it would say there's a dispute. There was no one disputing this.
But they give you sources in Wikipedia, on all
So I went back to look at the sources.
Yeah.
Guess where the sources were for 2nd century BC? There were two Islamic sources from two gentlemen that were living in 1500 AD.
Okay, I can see that now.
1500 AD. This is 800 years, or the 15th century AD, sorry, for 1400 AD. This is 800 years after Muhammad was born. That's the source for Jeddah. And I said, why didn't I see that? So I went back to my team and I said, look, back to my researchers. I have a whole research team that does research for me. And within a day, I was told to go back to my old professor, Dr. Gerald Hotting. Dr. Gerald Hotting, I studied under when I was there at School of Oriental and African Studies. And he was the one that has probably written the best book on the Red Sea, and he has also written a book on Jeddah. Mm-hmm. And this is what I found when I went back to Dr. Gerald Hotting. The reason why they didn't go up the Red Sea on the eastern side, or the Arabian side, is because they were on the wrong coast. You don't go up the Arabian coast. To understand that, we need to look at a map of the Red Sea from space using a topography camera. So actually, this is what you can get from, I'm just getting this off of, you can get this off of Google. You know, that when you do Google, you either have a map or you have the topographical terrain. Taking a look at that, and this is somebody that came up to me back in 2013, Charo Zazaro, actually referred to this. So we're talking about almost 8 years ago. This was already brought up as an argument. When you look at the Red Sea, you will notice that there is a channel. Can you see the channel there? Right in the middle. Here, let me show it to you. It's right there where the red arrow goes.
But I mean,
that's a deep sea channel.
That's the deep. Yes. It's kind of like a valley, a rift, if you wish, in the middle. Yes.
And that's where the big ships go today.
Right.
We need that channel for the large ships, these large container ships that got stuck there in the Suez Canal a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. That's the channel they would use. But see, back in the 7th century AD, they didn't have large ships like that.
Right.
They had much smaller ships. So where are the channels for them? Well, these are the channels for them. Take a look where they are. Those are the golden arrows. See the golden arrows? Mm-hmm. There are two channels on the western side of the Red Sea where all the smaller ships went up. Now, why did they go on the western side and not on the eastern side? Yeah, we need to ask that question. Well, for the very good reason, unlike the eastern Arabian shore, which is the over on this side, which is very arid, there is no water there. There is no vegetation there. It is desert. You know, you've grown up there. You have to salinate your water there, and there's not large fields, rich fields. You import most of your vegetation because now today they are now creating fields because today in the 21st century they can do that, but not in the 7th century. None of that existed. They didn't have desalination plants in the 7th century. They did not. Couldn't find water. There was just no water along the eastern coast. So there were not large populations. If there's no water, there's no vegetation, there are no people. But that's not the case for the western coast of the Red Sea. The African coast was very fertile. The African coast did have water. If you have water, you have vegetation. You have vegetation, you have people. You understand that. Everybody understands that. So the west coast had easily accessible ports. And we know their names. Now, this is my material. This is what I'd realized that I needed to do some research. So I went back and said, well, hold on a minute. If the channels are on the western coast, then there should be some historical evidence for that.
And that was my next question to you. What evidence are there to support this?
This is where you have to go back and do some historical sleuthing. So I went back there and I said, okay, let's see what we can find. And this is what I found. When you look at the archaic cities that existed on the Red Sea, except for Yanbu on the eastern coast, there is nothing else except way down here in the Hadmat area. There are ports down here, along with Aden. But there's nothing else from Aden almost all the way up to Yanbu, and certainly no Jeddah. What we do find are these ports. Let's take a look at them. So the first one is Assab, which is in today Eritrea. And it can be traced, it has documentation that goes all the way back to 246 BC. Is that before Muhammad? Is that before Islam?
Of course.
Obviously, that's the 3rd century BC. Mm-hmm. There's another port. This is Agilis. This is what Patricia Crone referred to because she found document after document on the western coast of India that had their names on it. It had their references. It had receipts from Agilis. Agilis was well known. From 79 AD, it was well known. Does that predate Islam?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Then we had another one in this time Sudan called Suakin, 170 AD. Does that predate Islam?
Of course.
And Muhammad and the Quran?
Yes.
Bingo. And then in Egypt, we have two ports, one called Berenice, which is 275 BC, and then the last one is Safaga, 282 BC. Notice they all predate Islam. Notice they're all on the western coast.
Exactly.
None of them are on the eastern coast. All the trade was on the western coast. Now take a look at them real carefully, and what do you notice? First of all, that their dates all predate Islam, and all of them are almost equidistant. That is one boat's ride. If you look at them, that's one boat's ride to there. That's a day's boat ride. That's another day's boat ride to there. Another day's boat ride to there, and another day's boat.
So that's how they would know that they are going to approach the end of their journey, for instance, by figuring out
these
how
cities
many
were
stops.
created for that very reason. These cities were created for small boats to make it in one day's ride, and that's why the ports were then created. They could have had there are a lot of fishing villages along there, but they were not ports because the boats didn't need to go to the fishing villages. They needed to go where the ports were because that's where they got their produces, that's where they got their water, and that's where
remember, they don't have ice to preserve food and things like that, so they need that quick stop.
They need the quick stops. And that's why nobody had bothered to look at the western coast. These have been there since the 3rd century BC. And I said, why hadn't we looked at that? Why didn't Patricia Crone look at that? Suggesting very clearly that on the Red Sea's eastern Arabian coast, only Yanbu can we find was a port city. And the reason why Yanbu was a port city was because of Yathrib.
And Yathrib, even Patricia Crone found it on ancient maps. It was there.
It's on Ptolemy's map from the 2nd century.
It makes sense why you have a port.
Ptolemy refers to Yathrib.
Yeah.
But Ptolemy in the 2nd century never referred to any place called Mecca, never referred to any place called Jeddah. I'm sorry, but it looks like your city did not exist at the time of
I'm excited.
Ptolemy.
It's a young city.
It's a very young city. Now, let's go on. So what about Jeddah? As a port city for Mecca, we started this, we've got to come back to this. This is going to be hard for you to hear, so you can either go back and shut your ears off or just go and take a coffee break if you want to, but we've got to talk about Jeddah. And that's why I went to Gerald Hotting. Gerald Hotting has been so good for us because he said very clearly that Jeddah did not exist until the 8th century. AD,
was
not
it in
BC,
a book or an
but AD.
article that he wrote?
It's his article. It's his book. I should have it off the top of my head. I don't have it in front of me. It's his book that he's written about the 1st century. He talks about the 1st century Islam.
Okay.
And he mentions very clearly. Now, why hadn't I read that? Why didn't the rest of it? But he didn't know that the trade. He didn't talk about the trade, and neither did Patricia Crone talk about the trade that went prior to the 8th century AD. We have no history for either Jeddah or Mecca until the 8th century. Why? Because neither had water nor a population large enough to accommodate early trade. Therefore, let's just get rid of Jeddah and let's just get rid of Mecca.
Yeah.
And
let me just
replace it with what? Because here's the problem. If you don't have Mecca, if you don't have Jeddah, what happens to Islam?
Well,
Bam.
I mean, at least the notion that there is a prominent city at the center of the universe, the center, a commerce city at the center of a trade route, all of that just goes out the window. Now, I want to just reiterate what Jay is saying here. The idea that there were caravans coming from Yemen all the way through Mecca is just unrealistic. I mean, you have to have been to that area. I've been there. I've been to Baha. I've been to the south. Mountainous areas. Why would you risk animals? There were no highways back then. Why would you risk animals and go through the risk of highway robbery and all that kind of stuff and trade, basically raiders and other, risk elements that will enable others to steal your stuff, or maybe the animals will die, or you yourself can suffer, and so on and so forth if you are the travelers. So Patricia Crone suggested that the sea route would be the alternative. But now we're even debunking that, saying that even if you have a sea route, you still need to have some strategic locations for rest, strategic locations maybe to resupply or to import and export things and so on and so forth. There were traders here that they want to send stuff, and there were traders who wanted to sell stuff. So we're finding now that all of the strategic port locations, what Jay is showing you here, are on the west coast, not on the east coast. That's one. Number two, you needed a port city that is the gateway towards a major city. Mecca is a major city, then the port city that associated with it would have been Jeddah. Yambo is a port city associated with a major city called Yathrib. But we're not finding that this information actually jives with Mecca and Jeddah, at least.
There you go. So not only has now Patricia Krona debunked Mecca as a land route, we this year have debunked Mecca as a sea route. So I want to show you what happened on March 13th. On March 13th, I went up and here this guy, Peter Haramos, who is one of the editors for Wikipedia, went up and he went up on, I think it was the Dutch one or it was, if you read right up there, he went up to Wikipedia and he changed it for that whole reference on Jeddah. The Danish one, he changed it. And then the next day he changed it for the English one. Because he realized that that was erroneous material. This is the impact that we have on YouTube. We're even changing Wikipedia and upgrading it and bringing it up to
scratch. What you're saying is we are eradicating fake news with real news.
There you go. This is exciting because it's happening in just the last few months. And if we can change history just by looking at history, we're not only changing history, we're debunking Mecca. And if you debunk Mecca, you debunk Islam. Islam is absolutely dependent on three things: on one book, one man, and one place. Right now, we're debunking the place. And we're debunking it historically, and we're also debunking it geographically.
And brother, I mean, I know some people might ask about Gerald Harding's basically book or article. How do you spell his name in case they want to?
Hawting. Okay. Gerald, Gerald, Hawting, Hawting.
Yeah, and if whenever we find it, we'll make sure it's in the description of this particular video for people to go and inspect what you just shared with them.
Yeah.
All right, well, what's next?
We're going to, this is something that Gibson has helped us out with. Dan Gibson not only looks at the Qibla, he also looks at the Hajj. He looks at you've been on the Hajj, you've done the Hajj.
That's the major pilgrimage, yeah.
And that's there are 5 stages in the Hajj. Are they unique? Now, according to the standard Islamic narrative, they are unique. They have been there since the time immemorial. We're going to debunk that next.
Well, you've heard it, folks. We are in the business of debunking. That's why we drink a lot of coffee, because we need a lot of
caffeine.
We are
mythbusters.
Amen to that. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We welcome, of course, your comments, interaction, just like the example that Jay just showed from one of the editors of Wikipedia, you said? We need interactions like this because we're not really in the business of creating fake news. No. We're telling you, hey, last time we said this, we discovered new material, and now we are showing you that the new material even contradicts whatever has been said about certain areas. Now, even if the new material goes against what we have concluded last time, it's okay with us. We're researchers, right? I mean, we want to be fair, we want to be honest, and we want to present to you the facts, and you still have a responsibility to go and inspect what we're sharing with you. I mean, I tell people this, you are without excuse anymore. I mean, Patricia Krona didn't have YouTube, but you have YouTube. You have internet, you have access to online libraries, you can do that research. You find something that still challenges this narrative that we're sharing with you, send it our way. We will examine it, and if it is worthy to be discussed, we will bring it to the forefront because we have no agenda. All our agenda is to share the truth and things that help you, especially as a Muslim viewer right now, wake up from the deep sleep. I was in that deep sleep for the longest time of my life, and I also didn't have YouTube, and I did not have Google, and I didn't have websites to help me. You have that now, and you're without excuse to say that you are still insisting that the standard Islamic narrative is true. It is not. That I can assure you. Thank you for watching. Until next time, have a blessed day. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, Sira International, and click on the bell so that you receive notifications whenever we publish a new video or go live. I would also like to appeal to you to consider becoming a Patreon patron by clicking the link right below. By doing so, you can give towards the production of these videos. There are also other options for you where you can give to our channel. I thank you from the bottom of my heart.